Right, welcome everybody. Tonight we're going to chatter a little bit about chapter 6, and I am that, which is entitled Meditation. Um, for most of us, I suspect meditation has been at least at some point in time in this journey a feature. And so what's interesting about tonight's piece is that Nisargadatta takes this and aims it, if you will, to a very non-dual or Advaitic perspective. And that's kind of the fun part. My first years were spent in Osho's ashram, which was a kind of a mecca for meditation. It was meditation 24/7. And so we would those of us that were in the ashram would hear about meditation all the time. I mean, we did more meditation and heard more about what meditation was about than you could ever imagine. And it's really interesting that this particular perspective is much different, and we'll talk about why he explains or talks about meditation in the way that he does. It's interesting. I don't know. I have a feeling when I read these that um, maybe I interpret too much, but the questioners I find really sometimes hilarious because they drive at things with kind of an interesting set of assumptions, you know. So the very first question starts out, which I had to laugh at. He goes, "All teachers advise to meditate. What's the purpose of meditation?" Now, I find it interesting that Nisargadatta decides he's going to answer the second half of that, which is what's the purpose of meditation? Because those of you who probably have read a lot of Nisargadatta or hung around any of the folks that teach out of his particular style, um, he doesn't advise meditation, and in fact, many times he will advise not to meditate, and there's a specific reason for that. But I just found it interesting that Nisargadatta decided in this particular conversation, rather than to say, well, wait a minute, I actually am one of those people who don't, give that particular piece of advice. He let that one slide and moved right on to the second piece of the question. And so where he goes with this, which is pretty interesting, is he wants to take you right to the I am, and we've talked about the I am before. So what he says is, he says, we know the outer world of sensations and actions. And this is the piece I think Michael posted on the page. He said, but our inner world of thoughts and feelings, we know very little. And he said, the primary purpose of meditation is to become conscious of and familiar with our inner life. And the ultimate purpose is to reach the source of life and consciousness. So you can see in this very first response, he's framed up the process of moving to the I am, and then from the I am to beyond the I am. So he's very consistent and true to his particular purpose when he speaks about this. And that's the framing I'm talking about. And as you read this, you're going to see he pounds on that again and again and again in this conversation. Um, and then he goes on. This is a really interesting piece because he says, this is the piece about when you look at most all work that happens in the seeking and spiritual world, the assumption that the beyond is beyond the knower and the known, the perceiver and the perceived, um, that isn't dealt with very often. It's just simply, well, this is meditation. Get into action relative to the meditation. You're going to see this questioner. He's all about that. Well, what do I do? How do I deal with it? It almost feels like he's frothing at the mouth because the answers he keeps getting are answers of ultimately what you're going to do is you're going to be at the witness, and then the happenings of consciousness happen by themselves. And this particular questioner is not finding that very satisfying. And usually folks that are at the beginning of their path don't find it very satisfying either. I always remember when I first got to the ashram in India, and they looked at me, and I remember I'd flown across the world for 20 whatever hours. I'm there at 7 in the morning. Of course, I'm probably pretty haggard. And they said something very spiritual to me. Now I'm fresh out of the business world. And they said, well, why don't you take a few days and arrive? And I remember looking at them going, are you are you blind? Are you not look? I'm here. I have arrived. So let's move, And I remember, of course, it's over time I started to acquire this language that we all use about things like that. But I was absolutely stunned that somebody would ask me, to take a few days and arrive. It's like, no, the plane flies you in, you get yourself a taxi here at the ashram, spend the night in the hotel, and here we are. Let's go. So that's what's going on here. So he introduces this concept right out the gate. He says, we are slaves to what we do not know. Of what we know, we are masters. He said, whatever vice or weaknesses in ourselves we discover and understand its causes and its workings, he said, we overcome it by the very knowing. So that's the very unsatisfying piece, if you will, right? Because, as a doer, the assumption of being a doer, and I came here to do something. I'm here sitting you asking you questions, and what you're going to do is you're going to give me an answer. I remember in that very same conversation, they were like, well, what did you come here for? And I said, I don't know. I've heard that there's this thing called enlightenment. I was very, very raw, so I didn't know much. And they said, well, how would you imagine that you would achieve enlightenment? I said, wow, that ought to be pretty easy. I said, you make me up a list of stuff, I'll knock them off one at a time. When I'm done, I'm enlightened. That's got to be that's how everything else works. This much must be how this works, right? So this unsatisfying piece is the piece that this questioner is being faced with. And Nisargadatta gives it to him right out the gate. He said the unconscious dissolves when brought into the conscious. The dissolution of unconscious releases energy. The mind feels adequate and becomes quiet, right? So the doer, in essence, in the witnessing, the doer becomes, if you will, inoperable, or maybe the inoperability is recognized. I'm not sure. In the beginning, it's very difficult to stop the doer, but nonetheless, he's painting this in real beautiful language right out the gate, and that's so he'll continue to do that, because look at the next question. What is the use of a quiet mind? So that's not evidently what this questioner was looking for. You tell me that meditation will generate a quiet mind. Is there anything else on the list that it generates? Because I'd like maybe to pick my options. I'm not sure a quiet mind's the one I would have picked right out the gate. And he goes on to say, he says, when the mind is quiet, right, we come to know ourselves as a pure witness. So immediately takes him to the I am, and from the I am, the witnessing begins. He said the personality based on self-identification. Now, a lot of times that little piece gets kind of conflated in a way, because people think that what happens is that, we kind of learn something and then we identify with it. And of course, we use language and causality, so we think of things that way. But the reality is that the building of oneself is a lot like building a brick wall. And if the bricks are the false concepts, the cement that holds them together, that's the glue, that's the identification. And every single brick has a complete, if you look, depth and, depth and height and everything, it has a complete rounding, if you will, of glue. So every piece that builds you as this false who you think you are is built brick at a time with the glue of identification dripping as it's put in place. Right. So it's based on self-identification. That doesn't happen to it, which is how a lot of people think of it. It's actually part and parcel of the building. And that's always something to think about, because when you look at people who do a lot and long meditation, you're dissolving all of that glue. Right. So that sometimes isn't going to take 3 or 5 or 10 minutes. That's going to be, go ahead.
The imagery, I love imagery. I
Mm.
do. I love imagery and stuff. The imagery that I always had was a tapestry, that this story is a tapestry, it's a weaving, and the dissolving is, you pull this thread and all of a sudden you just keep pulling and it becomes, you know, it just goes
Well,
on.
and I love that one too, because you know how that works, right? When you do the pulling of the thread, the dissolution is kind of happening by itself, right?
Yeah.
In other words, there's the pull of the thread, and then all of so now the witnessing, if you will. I mean, you can actually put the witnessing in there with it because that is a great metaphor, if that's what it is. Example, how's that? That for sure works. So it's a great example because the dissolution of a tapestry certainly happens that way. So I like that as well. He said the personality based on self-identification, on imagining oneself to be something, I am this, I am that, continues, but only as part of the objective world, right? So what he's saying is, its identification with the witness snaps, right? So this who you think you are by standing in the witness or being in that witness position, if you will. Now, once again, it sounds like you're doing something when you migrate to the witness position. But the recognition here is that the witness, it already exists in there. And he runs into he starts to talk about sattva and how that plays, but which in essence is the pure harmony of emergence. And so that particular piece, if you will, is always there. So
So,
the meditate. Go ahead, Joseph.
so Alan, so when he's saying its identification with the witness stamps, snaps, he means that the personality's identification with the witness.
Yes.
Okay, got it.
Yeah. Yeah. That part snaps. So a lot of times the question is, it's like, hey, the I am plays a witness role, if you will.
Mhm,
And that's true. And
mhm.
then there's the snap, and now it's from beyond the I am that the witnessing occurs, right? That the snap creates that particular perceiving.
Right. So I don't know the snap by experience, but I know the I am. I
Yeah.
know that part.
Yeah. Well, I'm just saying. So yeah, don't get too locked into the how it happens piece because a lot of things happen quietly or they happen not so quietly.
Mhm.
So when people start to compare, one of the things we do, especially, Westerners, and I'll chat about that in a minute, but is that we universalize everything. So if he says there's a snap, what did Joseph and Alan go? We're good American boys. We go looking for the damn snap. That must have happened, right? But that don't the thing I'm saying is that the location of beyond the I am, that there doesn't need to be some moment where that's immediately identifiable. That shift can happen very quietly.
Right. So I mean, I can get that, but when I read something like that, I say, okay, have I ever had that experience? Have I been aware of that
Yes.
experience? And I'm not sure I have. So I'll say, that's why I can say that I can have the experience of witness as the I am, but this snapping of the witness or something beyond the witness, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I've tasted.
Well, Well, think for a minute about experience itself. How often do you go and you're having an experience and suddenly you go, wow, look at where I am, right, if you will. I mean, that's probably how you would, linguistically render it. So you say something like that, but if you asked yourself to track from where you started to where you were when that moment of recognition, you probably, at least a lot of times, there's no way to do
Oh,
that.
you can't track it. That's right.
Yeah. So that's all I was after is to say, the snap, if you will, you and I go looking for that, but the reality is, that isn't necessary. It's simply the movement has happened and whether or not there was an awareness of that movement or not is ultimately irrelevant.
Oh, okay.
I think a lot of discoveries that we make a lot of times are things that are kind of they've already happened. You go, oh, holy cow. you know, and here it is. This is actually what's going on. And so, as I say, being very Western, we like to go back and see if we can track our way into it. And I'm just making the point that's not really a necessary thing to do. So just think about it, see, play with that and see. I think you'll come to the place where I'm talking about.
Okay, good, thanks.
Yeah, yeah, no worries. No worries. So it's really interesting, you know, that then the next thing that happens, and this reminds me of kind of um the new agey world that we see out there a lot, because Nisargadatta is very on the ground. So the one thing you're not going to get is a lot of that. There aren't a lot of levels and categories and places. You know, it's, you know, experience is a unibody kind of a thing. It's here it is. We don't classify it, level it. So the questioner goes, you know, as I can make out, I live on many levels, and life on each level requires energy. So imagine the thinking it takes to render that kind of version of what you are doing as you go through life, right? Because you get up in the morning, go to the train station, and if I said to you, "Can you talk to me about the different levels of life that are happening right now?" You'd look at me and go, "There's one thing happening. I went to the train station." Right? That was the happening of of this particular morning, was this movement to the train station, and the perceiving and the experience of it all was one thing. So in a way, I mean, you can see the question itself. It says the self by its very nature delights in everything and its energies flow outwards. He says, is it not the purpose of meditation to dam up the energies on the higher levels, or to push them back and up so as to enable the higher levels to prosper as well? Right. So he has a map, if you will, of how what meditation is intended to do. And you can imagine that was the thing I was talking about earlier. You know, when I was in the ashram, there were thousands of people, and you could walk a block down to the German bakery and sit down at a wooden table and listen to 12 or 15 people talk about things like exactly like this. You know, what it was doing, what it was doing to your body, what was doing, you know, all of the different bodies. You know, there's this body and that body, you know, and I mean, it was really quite a complicated thing, and a lot of conversations really settled and dwelled on that. And so you can see that this coming to this with this baggage, you know, he's going to go back and he's going to dissolve that. And so his, you know, his response is, he was very nice about this, which is very unlike Nisargadatta. He go he goes, it is not so much a matter of levels as of the gunas. He says meditation is a sattvic activity. Right. He said so, and aims at the complete elimination of tamas, which is inertia, and rajas, which is motivity. Right. Now, I always use the terms volume and velocity. Right. That what happens is that there's a volume and velocity to manifestation. And in any given moment, in the very present moment of witnessing and seeing, right, there is no sense of that particular thing. It's in the mind when it's extended from past to future, right? Or when it says, how much am I accounting for? How much am I accounting for, and how fast is it moving? Volume and velocity. So that's what he's after. He's saying that's not what it is. He says pure sattva, and the word they use in here is harmony, which I'm not sure I would use that. I might use the word silence. Sattva, I think, is pure silence. That's how I would always, is perfect freedom from sloth and restlessness, right? So those are mind kind of sicknesses, if you will. That's what's going on. And so he's talking about this extension that we make in the mind. And he's telling this questioner, no, that's not what's happening. What's happening is, you know, meditation is about being here and now and in the present. And when that happens, those other things are in essence eliminated. Right? Now, go ahead. You're going to say something?
No,
Okay.
Well, I was thinking that when you were saying that you were sitting and listening to all the conversations, and I have been in the same situation where, around being with a teacher and then going away and sitting around and conversing and so on. And it seems to me all of these stories are different. And so the experiences of what's occurring, if you want to use that word, is going to be different, because the dissolution of all the conditioning is going to be different, because the conditioning was different. So you can't pinpoint this is the way it happens, right?
Correct. That's that universality thing I talked about earlier, right?
Yeah.
We assume universality into play. So we say, I'm a human being, you're a human being. There must be a universal version of what happens. And that's that's an issue. Now, the other thing that we could say is that I always find it interesting because I always use a story where I had these beautiful dogs. I had this big haul. I would go walk them on the beach every day, but my one boy dog, he absolutely delighted in taking the socks from me because I had to put them on to, put my shoes on. But he was also very, desirous of going to walk. And of course, it was very difficult to tell the dog that stealing my socks was actually an obstruction to us going out for a walk. That was kind of a problem. Um, and so, and in a way, if you look at this, it's the same thing. The thing that you see is the nature of the human mind. Where does it want to go? It wants to go out to manifestation. So we go and we sit to a master who says, Nisargadatta in this particular piece, look, the point of the whole exercise is to pull the energy out of the manifestation. And where do you look now? You look internally. The looking becomes inner, right? And then we leave the front room or wherever it is, the meditation hall, we go down to wherever it is we go down to. And what's the first thing we do? We start to delineate, describe, and talk about the systems of manifestation, right? So in a way, we're just like my dog was, we're getting this amazing, point of view, but we're so conditioned to locating in in manifestation that our conversations are all about manifestation. That's what they become. I always talk about Ramesh because people would say the bell would go on about, or the light would go on about, once every week, and somebody go, wait a minute. In the end, all you really need to do is sit in silence. And you get that smile on his face, and he says, you're absolutely right. He said, but you guys keep asking me questions, right? You keep going out to manifestation, and I keep pulling you back. And now you saw the light, right? So you're absolutely right. So here's an idea, think about your incessant need to ask all of these particular questions, right? That's actually part of the exercise is, for what are you asking the questions? Right? Because the way we ask questions is so that we can expand, identify, do all the things we do with manifestation. And that's absolutely the opposite of what meditation is pointing at. So that's something to think of. So anyway, he goes on. So here he says, the next thing he asks is how to strengthen and purify the sattva. Now, we all know in here that just is, right? It's like absolute awareness or apperception or whatever. It just is, right? So the activity of meditation is an uncovering so that the obscuring of all of that by this buying into who we are can simply unravel like a tapestry by itself, right? But the questioner is going, well, how do I strengthen and purify it? And he says, it's always pure and strong. It's like the sun. It may seem, now notice, it may seem obscured by the clouds and dust. He's always going to go after the fact that who you are as an individual is that which obscures the possibility of identifying with who it is you really are. Right. Now that's a bad way of saying it because we've already talked about earlier that the witness in essence snaps and there you are. You already are that. So yeah, so the identifying doesn't, doesn't really need to happen. It's already there. He says, so here he says, deal with the causes of obscuration, not with the sun. So let what obscures unwind itself.
Not this, not this, not this.
Exactly same. It's exactly that. So then, of course, he must be getting frustrated because the next question is, well, wait a minute, what's the use of sattva? Right, which is kind of a crazy question, but that would be, one of the questions. What's the use of this thing? Right, because why talk about anything that doesn't have a use? Now, when what the whole point of the exercise is to recognize oneself as not the autonomous doer, asking what the use of something is or isn't, right? What does it feed into? It feeds into the autonomous doer. The doer wants to know what the use of things are, right? The pure witness doesn't really care, right? Use of things really isn't part of the conversation.
More space than you want to do. But the real like this is focused on health and wellness, which is one.
Hey, I'm sorry. Can you mute that? Thanks, man. Appreciate that. So he gives a great answer. He goes, well, what's the use of truth, goodness, harmony, and beauty? Right? He said they are their own goal. They manifest spontaneously and effortlessly when things are left to themselves, are not interfered with, not shunned or wanted or conceptualized, but just experienced in full awareness. Such awareness, now he says that, such awareness is sattva. That would be, to me, the best definition of that. It does not make use of things, it fulfills them. So you have to ask yourself, well, okay, interesting. How many people come to this that have been left to themselves, that have not been interfered with, not shunned, wanted, or conceptualized? How many people have led a life where that happened? Right? Nobody that I have met. So bottom line, what you see, the meditation and the unraveling of all of that has the possibility of delivering someone to again, I hate that language, but anyway, it unobscures and allows for what is already there in its natural way to be what is happening. And you can see that what it does is it does not make use of things and people. It simply fulfills them. It is what it is. It's its own purpose. Right. So I always love it, when people, they'll talk about, what is consciousness, right? And what consciousness is simply the exercise of seeing itself. That's all consciousness is. Most people really hate that answer, right? When what the purpose of something is to reveal itself to itself, and there's no purpose or use in that definition, that really gets pretty upsetting to everyone, right? Like, okay, yeah, but what else does it do? Right? Can it butter my toast? Whatever it is that becomes a use, in the situation, right? So here he goes, and it's funny. This is a really short one, by the way. So we're coming to the end of what it is. He said, "Well, he wants to do something. Since I cannot improve sattva, am I to deal with the tamas and rajas only? How do I deal with them?" Right? Wants to give me something to do. Right now, I talked about my ashram experience. I kept going to them and saying I need to do something. So they put me into a primal group, which was 21 days of silence. So they gave me something to do. I'd never been in silence in my life, never been in India in my life. And now here I am. That's what I'm doing. So, I got my wish. I got 21 days of doing something. And I started to learn that might not be the point of the exercise. But nonetheless, that was my experience. And so He says, by, again, goes right back to it, by watching their influence in you and on you, be aware of them in operation. Watch their expressions and your thoughts, words, and deeds, and gradually their grip on you will lessen. So he's not he's telling him, but he's once again, to most doers, that's a very unsatisfying answer. Watch, and then the action happens as a result of simply the watching. That's all that happens. And the clear light of sattva will emerge. And then he goes on to say, here's the last sentence of the whole thing. It's neither a difficult nor a protracted process. So all of that stuff that we talk about, the levels and how, and the 58 kinds of meditation and all of that, right? Kind of unnecessary. So when he speaks of things, he doesn't do that. And then he says, earnestness is the only condition of success. Now, earnestness, he talks about a lot. He really does. And I remember with Ramesh, it was the conversation that we would have, because when I went to India, the one thing I really noticed was that as a Westerner, I wasn't very equipped to walk into a meditational tradition or path. It just wasn't something that, a kid from Southern California that grew up in the 60s would have acquired along the way in any particular way. Everything was going to be thought constructed. The belief was that those thoughts and constructions yielded something, and all of the other things that go with that. So when he talks about earnestness, he's talking about something that actually occurs, and it's not even an attribute, if you will. It's something that's already there. It's the natural movement of consciousness, and what's being done with it, it's actually being pointed back at yourself. So as a Westerner, I just noticed that we have a conditioning, and that our conditioning has a tendency to take us without noticing, right, to a place that feels like it's what we would call earnestness, but really what it's mind pressure, right? It's a whole bunch of mind stuff. And I always like to put that out there when I talk to a basically Western audience, so that you can just simply, as you watch, you can see how we are driven. And I have a little story. It's a fun story. I'll tell you. I grew up in Southern California, and um, so if you do that, the one thing that's available to everyone is the beach. Beach is available to everybody, and you surf, and you boogie board, and you snorkel. And in fact, when I was a child, there was a place called Doheny that had these snorkeling pools, and the mothers would go down with whatever. Now, there were 4 boys and a girl in my family, so mom took the 4 boys, gave them snorkels, and said, "Go snorkel," because she could sit on the side and get a little bit of breathing, and the boys were going to go snorkel like crazy people. And so we grew up from the time of 3 or 4 or 5 years old, and these ponds were only, about 4 or 5, 6 feet deep at the deepest, and probably 3 or 4 feet. So moms could track you, and each one had its own. They could sit in front of one and say, "Okay, I can watch the kids," and that happened. But what happened to us is that as a life experience, we became one. Our relationship to the ocean was that we were part of that thing, right? Because we were in it, and we did it, and that was what that was about. And I can remember, we would go over, if you got lucky, you could get over to Catalina, 26 miles away. And Santa Catalina has this beautiful bay in it, and it's some of the clearest water in the world. And when I was a kid, it would amaze me because, the chain, you see a chain when a boat is anchored that goes all the way to the bottom. You could see the links on the chain from the top all the way to the bottom, and the ones on the bottom were as clear as the ones on the top. Right. So you can imagine, it didn't take a PhD, a child of whatever who had been in the water for most of their life. They saw this and they're like, okay, hallelujah. This is the best water ever. And so, of course, that really drew us. I remember some years later, we were teenagers, and we were out. And what they did in Catalina is they decided to introduce this thing called a glass bottom boat, because it was so clear. They could put a glass on the bottom of the boat, and they could get everybody into the glass bottom boat, and they could take you out. And through the glass, you could see this amazingly clear all the way to the bottom experience. And the people in the boat were basically describing the flora and the fauna and all of the things that were happening. It was, most beautiful description of anything you've ever heard in your entire life. And I remember as a teenager thinking to myself, there was just a niggling that I had, right? There's something really wrong here. Like, I don't know what it is, but they're describing everything, but there's something wrong here. I don't get it. And I puzzled, and by personality, I have a nature to basically grind on things. So once there's something in there, and so if there's something wrong, I'm going to grind on it. And usually the answer will reveal itself, sometimes over a long period of time, but that's a different story. But bottom line, I remember one day I was sitting with my friends and I go, I got it. Because I told them that. I said, guys, are you listening to, there's something wrong with that? And everybody agreed with me. All of us who grew up snorkeling at Doheny, and now we're in Catalina, all the teenagers, and we're hitchhiking down and coming up with money to get across to Catalina. But they were like, yeah, there's something wrong with this. And I said, you know what? It's as if these people have never been in the water.
Exactly.
They're describing this thing, but they haven't been here. They haven't been there. They haven't been part of what it is. They can describe it, but they've never been part of what that is. And I always remember that, because when I got to India, I remember that story and I went, oh, I'm now on the glass bottom boat when it comes to the world of seeking and meditation, right? I didn't live in a culture, right? When you think of awakening, it needs to live in the culture that it arises within. Our culture doesn't by nature, right, have a meditative core. It just doesn't. So what that means, of course, is that when we're looking at this, most of us are going to come to this with the glass bottom boat, right? And over time we sink into it, right? But by nature, we haven't been in the water. And that's something I think that if you recognize about our conditioning, it's really incredibly helpful, right? Because the other thing that we like to do is the minute that we figure something out, we like to package and deliver it, right? That we're, if you think about Americans particularly, we're really good at that, because you might be able to sell it, make some money. I don't know, but we're really, if you think about how ideas, you're in school and the first thing you're encouraged to do is to take the concepts that you now know, and they make you package it and you deliver it, right? You're going to tell people about it. You're going to, and that's what we do. And so what happens a lot with meditation, if you watch, is that people get into it, they think they know what it's about, and then they package it and they deliver it. And I just think that that's something, over time, that if you just watch yourself with that, everyone will sink into the meditative space, no doubt about it. But it's likely not to be a natural piece of our Western conditioning. It's just something to note. And by just simply knowing that that's the case, it makes it a lot easier to actually swim in the water, so to speak, by knowing, hey, everybody had to start first day, put the snorkels on, you're 5 years old. Everybody started at the beginning, no problem, right? But stay in the beginning. Don't try to acquire what you think you need to know and move to the end. Stay in the meditative space. Don't naturally move out of it because of your conditioning. So that's just something that I would point out. At least it was a big help for me, because when I walked into this ashram and people were meditating, and I was like, wow, well, what is going on here is not something I'm familiar with. And I had done meditation, you can imagine, and I had spent out hundreds of hours sitting at the Bodhi Tree Library reading these books, and I'd gone to meditations when they would offer them at different places. So I'd had the Western version, and I was still just gobsmacked when I ran into a world of meditators who really embraced and lived, and they had grown up in the water. And so I knew that it was that this particular thing, part of it was learning, what is it that kept me from, was there something that kept me from being ultimately someone who was in the water? And that was and that's just something I think to take note of. So anyway, so that's it. Believe it or not, it was a really short one, this little piece here. I don't know if you realize it's this chapter 6, it's a page and a half. and he really locates it. He's very specific. He goes through and goes, here's what meditation is about. Now, remember the one thing about meditation, the reason that Nisargadatta and a lot of the Advaitic and non-dual folks don't like to recommend meditation. Why is that? Because most people make it a practice. And practices almost always live in the world of the known, the known and the knower and the known, or the perceiver and the perceived. In other words, it's a subject. I do meditation, right? So I am doing this task. And what that ends up doing is actually accentuating the false sense of who you are. Because in action, our action day in and day out, right, is always a support to the conditioning that we have, right? I don't know if you've ever, I always talk about language being a conditioner, right? It's I and you, object, subject. It's built piece on a time. It's basically a replication as much as can be of thought. Thoughts happen one at a time. They build, they're constructed, and then you get the outcome, right? So most everything we do really supports that. So that's what you have to be careful with, is understanding meditation, but not making it part of your subject object world. That's that's the thing. And if you look at how people do meditation, it's like, I do it every day. I do it at 9 and 12 and 5. I do, it's a practice, and that practice defines the who you are. And most of the time it's the who that we're trying, in essence, to let dissolve. Right. So there's that old story, the Mutt and Jeff, where they're going up the hill, right? And Mutt's in this car, right? And all it has is a brake and whatever. It's just it's like a little box car, and Jeff is pushing him up the hill, and they get to the top of the hill, and Jeff says, "Oh my God," he said, "that was the hardest thing I ever did." He said, "I was so worried that I couldn't get you there, and the car would hurtle to the bottom." And Mutt said, "Don't worry, I had you covered. I had the brake on the whole time." That's what meditation is once you make it a model of, I am doing whatever that is that's being done, right? You're pushing the car to the top of the hill and you have the brake on the whole time. That's why Nisargadatta and Ramesh and Ramana and all of those folks, and you can go into, you can pick almost all of them, would say, be really careful with how you frame the meditative activity up in your own world, in your own life. That's what that's all about. All right. Any questions, guys? Comments, questions? Go for it, Don.
Yeah, but if you're meditating, you have to start somewhere. It
Yes.
seems like. And so if you start with, I am the meditator, this is the meditation, I am meditating, which is where I don't know where else one would start. But then if the meditation is good, or it's a valid meditation, whatever that means, then in the process of the meditation, you find that you are not the meditator, that you're being meditated. So that it would be really okay, because I know a lot of the non-dual people that I hang with, like, don't meditate, don't meditate. It's just like, I think in my experience, meditation brings me to a non-dual state.
Well,
Even though I walk in thinking that I'm the meditator.
no, and I think that's the point, Don.
Yeah.
In other words, what's the point of meditation? It's to slow down the volume and velocity. In other, when you meditate, think about it, right? You slow down. You're not like running to do this, or you slow down the volume and velocity, right? And it's an attempt to replicate awakening. It's an attempt, right? That's what its attempt is, right? So the non-dual state, as you describe it, is exactly what the point of that exercise is, right? So when I'm talking about not setting yourself up, all I'm saying is watch yourself in terms of how methodical you make it. That's all I'm after, because I think it's great to meditate. And the one thing I think meditation delivers, right, is that sense of earnestness, right? It takes you out of the mind, and it's, when you start to talk about what earnestness is, it's that sense, if you will, of the meditation. So I'm 100% behind what you're saying. And yes, I do notice that, a lot of non-dualists, they think what that means is that someone told them that they didn't have that work didn't need to happen. Right. And it's not that work doesn't need to happen. It's that you are doing the work that doesn't need to happen, but the work will continue to happen. Right? It happens spontaneously. It arises by itself, just as meditation will. But I think you're dead on. Well, I totally agree with exactly what you just said. Yeah. It's amazing how many people are dedicated to a spiritual search and are looking for ways not to have to do all the stuff that seemingly needs to be done. Right. I find that really, really kind of funny. It's almost like the kids that want to be great at baseball that don't want to practice. It's kind of like that. It's kind of like that kind of approach. Yeah. But that great comment, actually.
But
I hope.
I have a friend who wants to have a discipline with meditation, and she has every morning her morning cup of coffee. And I asked her, I said, are you disciplined? Is this a discipline for you to have your cup of coffee? And I said, my meditation is like your cup of coffee.
Yeah. I go in every single morning. I mean, every now and then I don't, but I'm out of 365 days, 360 of them, I put my dogs in the Jeep, and one of them barks at trucks and the other one eats biscuits, and we go get my cup of coffee. Now, I can tell you honestly that the magnetism of that cup of coffee spins its spell every single morning, and the coffee going happens, right? It's not, there's nothing in there that says at 9 o'clock I need to go have a cup of coffee, right? That coffee draws the body, mind, Allen in it's really good. It's really consistent. That cup of coffee is part of it. So, but there's a difference. I mean, there's a felt experience different. One can see, one can see what's happening. Because it's almost, you can use that kind of sense, the magnetization versus the pushing. It's like when you make yourself do something, it's like you push it into place every day. At 9 o'clock, I need to push this into place. Whereas at 9 o'clock every day, I just need to let myself be magnetized to the cup of coffee that wants to deliver itself to Alan.
Yeah, my experience is it's not a practice, it's not a discipline, it's a love. And so it's
Exactly.
just moving towards the love.
Yeah, and remember, that's what he said with it at one point when he was talking about, goodness and all of those things that emerge naturally, right? So one of the things that I always really enjoyed was the if you look at just the different doorways, the tantric approach to spiritual movement is that when you were created, there was an original myth or story that consciousness created you with this original myth or story, right? And if that original myth and story simply lived itself, you're one step away from awakening, right? In other words, it's the one who's been undisturbed and all of the rest of that, right? So what it also is it's a pure embrace of every activity in life to see which ones of those generate the love that you're talking about, right? So the cup of coffee is almost a tantric activity, right? It's the embracing of this beautiful cup of coffee, right? And that's the love you're talking about. And actually, Don, we could have used that in Don's question, right? That the meditation, the magnetism of the meditative state, if you will, right? So Don shows up to meditate because of the magnetization, not because Don gets pushed into place to do it at 9 o'clock every day. There's a difference in how those activities, make themselves happen.
Yeah, it's totally. I'm part of a recovery community, addiction recovery community called Recovery Dharma. And so it's based on Buddhism, and it's not like 12 steps. It's almost like the opposite of 12 steps. So so the people, when they first come in, I facilitate, we're 7 night a week program, and I facilitate 1 night a week. And when you see everybody first come in and they're new, and we sit down for meditation, because that's a big piece of it, and then we talk and we read and we do things like that. Usually they're really uncomfortable with it, because they may have just come off of, they're doing methamphetamine or something, and the dopamine hit isn't there. Meditation does not give you that dopamine hit. And so there's a whole lot of fidgeting and uncomfortableness, and when is this over kind of feel to it. And we have about 50 people on an average night. So you can see the group in all these different phases. And it's funny because over time, then there's this middle part where the meditation is the thing. And for the folks who come in, then if they're late and they miss the meditation, then it's, and I've missed 3 meditations this week and I'm afraid I'm going to relapse. And so it becomes very sort of like a dependency itself. And then there's this other phase after they've been doing it a long time and they've gotten some recovery time, where they become a facilitator, right? And so those of us are more in the observer sort of thing. Somebody's running the meditation, we're watching the group and we're chatting with each other, because we don't have to have that. And if we want that on the particular evening, we drop into it. There's no judgment about in it or out of it. And it's sort of like that's like you talked about in your class, the vehicle that gets you across the water. And then you can take it with you or not.
That's a Buddhist story, by the way, as you know. So
yeah. Oh, is it? Okay.
yeah. The boat that was actually they attribute that to Buddha himself.
Oh,
Yeah. When you take your canoe across the river, don't strap it on your back and carry it. Leave it and continue on.
exactly. Right.
Yeah.
And you can still row your canoe if you feel like it, but
Exactly. But
Right.
still, that's right. So that's a great way to describe kind of the process of, natural emergence versus, because, they're not getting the hit in the beginning, but then they basically become concerned, because if they don't do their meditation, they're going to relapse. So now that's the the identified self doing its freak out about whatever it is that it's now dependent on, right? Fair enough. And then that last stage,
as the self is very much there. Yeah.
and then the last stage, which is, the magnetization of the activity itself. If it happens, great. And if not, then one simply lives life. Life lives me, as it were. Yeah.
Mhm.
I love those little teaching parables, stories, whatever that you know, different religions, groups, whatever, use, to try and get messages across. One of my favorites that I ever heard was of 2 monks that were walking along on a journey, and of course they had taken a vow of celibacy, and not only celibacy, but also that they would never, ever, ever touch a woman in any instance ever, in any way. And they came upon a a river, and here sitting by the river was a woman, and she was crying. And so the one walked over to her and said, "Why are you crying?" Because he had compassion and empathy for, could tell that she was, distraught. And she said, I can't swim, and I need to get across the river, and I have no way to get across, and I don't know what I'm going to do." And so he says, "Well, get on my back. I'll take you over. I can swim, and we'll go, and I'll take you over." And so that's what happened, and he takes her over across the river, and the other one follows, and they get on the other side, and he puts her down, and she thanks him, and they go on their way. And as the 2 monks are traveling, quite some time later, the other monk looks at him and says, "I have to say something. We took a vow to never touch a woman, and you let that woman get on your back, and you carried her across the river." And the other looks at him and says, "Yes, I did. I carried her across the river, and you've been carrying her ever since."
Yep. Great story.
Yeah,
Great story.
yeah,
Awesome. All right. Have you guys had enough?
never. I love conversations.
Yeah, it's nice.